But David Leyonhjelm, Liberal Democrat Senator, joins me on the phone. David, good morning.
Good morning.
Appreciate your time today. Why do you say the federal government should get out of the business of restricting cannabis?
Well, there are two good reasons. One is just in terms of nanny state and in telling people what's good for them. The restrictions on cannabis are largely based on disapproval and false information that it leads to hard drugs and all sorts of terrible things. I'm opposed, and my party, the Liberal Democrats, are opposed to governments telling us what's good for us, irrespective of whether we approve of these things or not. If we're not hurting anybody else, our view is it's none of the government's business, and they should stay out of our lives and leave us to make our own choices, whether they're good choices or not. The other reason is simply cost. It costs way more to enforce cannabis laws than is reasonable. If you add both state and federal governments together, some assessments have it at over $1 billion. It's certainly $100 million just at the state level, just trying to intercept it at the border. And for what? We're not really achieving anything. It's as available as it's ever been. More than a third of the population have used cannabis at some point. The price hasn't risen in 20 years, which means supply is not being disrupted. So basically law enforcement is a failure as far as stopping availability. So what are we doing it for?
So the libertarian principle that if you're not doing anyone else any harm, leave me alone to live my life as I like. I understand that principle. But what if you are in fact doing harm to others? That certainly seems to be a concern of WA Police, and they point to rising levels of drug driving in jurisdictions where this has happened, particularly in some of those places in the United States where cannabis is now legal. That is potentially a very big danger.
It's not a particularly big danger, but yes, it's a risk, and the same argument applies to children. And we do attempt to restrict alcohol for the same reasons, to prevent harm to others when driving and to keep it out of the hands of children. And I don't argue with that. That's a legitimate thing. I have to say, though, that the police are being quite disingenuous, in fact, bordering on telling fairy stories about the impact of cannabis on driving. It's a relatively short period of time, a matter of, a couple of hours, or 3 or 4 hours at most, probably substantially less than that in most cases after having consumed cannabis. And there is a problem with the testing technology in that it can detect cannabis for several days after you smoke it. And the police are using that as an argument to say, oh, well, people are driving while under the influence of cannabis. It's not true. It's false. The period in which you are adversely affected as a driver after having smoked cannabis is relatively short. And it's certainly no dangerous in terms of affecting driving than alcohol is.
There's an emerging body of evidence that even in the jurisdictions where it has been legalised, that this hasn't necessarily done anything to deter the underground trade. I sort of understand the rationale that says you make it legal and you tax it and you turn it into a revenue stream, given that people are going to consume it anyway. But if people are operating outside of that bounds, it suggests that it's not going to be as simple to bring this into the legitimate economy as perhaps people think.
Yes, cannabis is easy to grow. Backyard plants and little mini commercial operations are quite common. So, yes, there is an issue about whether or not you can legitimise a market which is pretty informal. And I think what that means is that you shouldn't try to regulate it too much. If you want to bring it into the honest, open market, then you could tax it on the basis of GST. But if you try to regulate it, particularly severely, and there have been proposals, particularly from the Greens, to do exactly that, to have plain packaging on it, for example, and place excise on it, and all that sort of thing, I think it would be a total failure. If you are to legalise it and you want to bring it into the hands of honest people rather than criminals, you have to be reasonably mindful about how much regulation you impose on it. But in those states in America, where it's now legal, recreational marijuana, recreational cannabis is legal. It's largely coming into the legal arena. They are paying taxes. It's not particularly onerously taxed or regulated, and there is certainly some, self-growing still going on. But for most people, growing it yourself and harvesting it and drying it and all that sort of stuff is too much of a pain to worry about, so they'll buy it legitimately. And, of course, it does keep it out of the hands of criminals.
Okay, 922-11882. Listeners, you're hearing the argument being mounted by Senator David Leyonhjelm from the Liberal Democrats. I wonder what you make of it. I'd like to get your view. 922-11882. Should the federal government get out of the business of any restrictions on cannabis? Or would you prefer that this drug continue to be treated as it is now, as something to be deterred, as something that is illegal? Happy to take your views on this. David Leyonhjelm, do we really want to become a nation of stoners?
Well, look, about over a third of the population has used it. It's a recreational drug. It's like alcohol. Alcohol is a recreational drug. We're not a nation of drunks, so I don't think we would become a nation of stoners. Obviously, some people are silly and they will go to excess. There are some people who will not handle it well, but that happens anyway. And I don't think the fact that there's quite a very small percentage of people who will misuse anything is ever a legitimate reason to say, no, the rest of us can't have access to it. The truth is,
So do you extend that argument to other drugs as well? Cocaine or heroin or methamphetamine?
They are different because of their addictive nature. People can want to get off them, but can't because they are chemically addicted. I do think Portugal's example of treating drugs like that as a medical problem rather than a criminal problem is a successful model for us. It hasn't led to Portugal becoming a nation of narcotic addicts, for example. What they do there is not treat any drugs as a crime, possession of a crime. Dealing and manufacture is still criminal, but consumption isn't. And so addicts can be medically treated. There's no prospect of them being locked up and that sort of thing. They're being handled as if they have an illness. And I think that's a legitimate way to go as well. I mean, at the end of the day, other drugs are also fairly widely available. But cannabis is different from those in that it's not addictive. And some people love it and treat it as if it is addicted, as if they are addicted, but they're not chemically addicted like they are to heroin or cocaine.
All right. David Leyonhjelm, appreciate your time this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you.